The morning my mother-in-law decided to sell my apartment, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, watching the espresso machine exhale its last ribbon of steam. The light through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the pale, rinsed gold of early autumn, the kind of light that made the river below look like hammered pewter. I'd been up since 5, going over acquisition documents for a commercial property in the Harbor District, and the coffee was the only thing standing between me and a headache that had been building behind my left eye for 3 days. I remember thinking, as I reached for the cup, that this was the one quiet moment I'd have all day. The one pocket of stillness before the machinery of my life cranked back to life. Then I heard the drawer slide open in the bedroom. Not the soft, furtive slide of someone looking for a pen. The decisive, "this is mine now" slide of someone who believed she had every right. "Claire, sweetheart." Margaret's voice cut through the apartment like a paring knife drawn across porcelain. It had a particular frequency, sharp, bright, carrying, that seemed engineered to bypass walls and doors and whatever fragile piece I'd managed to assemble. I'd noticed it the very first day she moved in, and I'd noticed, too, that she never used it when Daniel was in the room. This place is just sitting here empty half the time. I already talked to your Aunt Patricia, well, not your aunt, but you know what I mean. My friend Patricia from the club. She knows an agent who specializes in luxury listings. We'll put it on the market, sell it by Christmas, and get you and Danny something bigger. Something with a proper guest room. Maybe a garden. I turned off the machine. Wiped my hands on the linen towel draped over my shoulder, a small, deliberate gesture, buying myself the half-second I needed to make sure my voice would come out steady. I walked down the hall that connected the kitchen to the master suite, my bare feet silent on the oak flooring. The apartment was 2,400 square feet of open-plan living, every surface chosen by me, every piece of furniture paid for by me, every view framed by windows I'd signed for. It was the first place I'd ever owned entirely alone, and I'd bought it 3 years before I met Daniel. The ink on the deed had dried long before he ever learned my last name. Margaret was perched on the edge of my bed. The red leather of the property deed was clutched in her fingers, her knuckles white with the grip of someone holding a winning lottery ticket. Beside her on the duvet sat an open canvas tote, the same one she'd brought from her old house in the suburbs when she'd announced, tearfully, that living alone was just too hard now that my Arthur's gone. It was stuffed with her nightgowns, her blood pressure medication, her reading glasses, and that thermos she'd been using for a decade, the one with the chipped enamel duck painted on the side. Seeing it there, on my 800 thread count sheets, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet, premonitory click. The sound of a lock engaging. She looked up at me and smiled. That smile. I'd come to know it so well it had its own taxonomy, the public version, warm and self-deprecating, deployed for neighbors and acquaintances, the private version, narrower, tighter, a calculation wrapped in maternal concern, and this one, the smile she wore when she was doing something she knew was overreach but had already decided she'd get away with. It said, "We're family. Family doesn't need permission. Family just takes." "Margaret," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned, in boardrooms full of men who called me Richard's little girl when they thought I couldn't hear, that volume is the enemy of authority. This apartment was purchased before the marriage. It's in my name. Sole ownership. She blinked. The smile retracted about half an inch, then held. "Darling, family doesn't count pennies. Danny's your husband." The vows said, "What's mine is yours," or was it the other way around? She laughed, a small, conspiratorial laugh that invited me to join in. "Anyway, your children will live here someday. Our grandchildren. We don't have children." I reached down and took the deed from her hand. It wasn't a snatch. It wasn't rude. It was the kind of movement that doesn't register as aggression because it's too certain, the way a tide takes back a sandcastle, grain by grain, with a patience that doesn't need to hurry. And Daniel didn't contribute a single dollar to this property. Margaret's face went red. The mottled, uneven flush of a woman who hadn't been told no in a very long time and discovered, in the moment, that she didn't have a graceful backup plan. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. I didn't wait to hear what came out. I walked to the safe, a discreet wall unit behind the framed photograph of my mother, the only photograph of her I still displayed. The safe beeped as I punched in the code. The bolt slid home with a satisfying mechanical clunk that echoed, just slightly, in the sudden silence. I put the deed inside. Closed the door. Heard the lock engage. Then I went upstairs. The staircase in the apartment was a floating design, open treads of walnut and glass. I was halfway up when I heard her on the phone. She'd waited just long enough to assume I was out of earshot, which meant she still didn't understand how sound traveled in this space, how the glass and the high ceilings and the absence of soft furnishings created a natural amphitheater. I could hear every word. "Don't you worry, Pat. Claire's a soft touch. She talks tough, but underneath all that businesswoman nonsense, she wants to be liked. Once the house sells, I'll put the money in Danny's account first. Just to keep it safe. You know how these career women are. They earn it, but they don't know how to keep it. That's what family is for." I stood on the top step, one hand resting on the glass balustrade, and looked down at the living room below. The river glittered indifferently through the windows. The sofa was exactly where I'd placed it. The art on the walls was mine. The books on the shelves were mine. Everything in this apartment was an extension of choices I'd made alone, and yet somewhere along the way, I'd allowed a woman with a canvas tote and a thermos to start treating it like her son's inheritance. I didn't cry. I didn't call my father. I didn't storm back down the stairs. I did math. Cold, clarifying, subtraction math. I calculated the weight of everything I'd given against the weight of everything I'd received, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I let myself see the numbers clearly. The balance was not in my favor. I met Daniel Wren at an industry cocktail party 6 years ago. I was 29, and I'd just taken over my father's holdings in the Eastern region, 3 commercial properties, a logistics chain, and a board of directors who still addressed their strategic questions to whatever man happened to be standing nearest to me. My father, Richard Linwood, had built his company from a single freight truck into a regional empire over 30 years, and he'd spent the last 5 of those years grooming me to take over. I was ready. I was more than ready. But readiness, I'd learned, didn't protect you from condescension. It just made the condescension more tedious to endure. That night, I wore a simple black slip dress, no jewelry except my mother's watch, a Patek Philippe that sat on my wrist like a quiet statement of fact. My mother had died when I was 14. The watch was the only thing of hers I still wore. It ticked against my pulse, a reminder I carried everywhere. She had been gentle, too gentle, and the world had not been gentle back. I decided, somewhere in the years after her death, that I would be a different kind of woman. Daniel was a mid-level associate at one of the partner firms, dispatched to handle the tedious logistics of the evening, making sure the caterers didn't run out of canapes, that the microphone worked, that the important people got their name tags spelled correctly. His suit was pressed within an inch of its life, the creases sharp enough to cut paper. When he approached me, I was standing by the window, nursing a glass of Chardonnay I'd been pretending to drink for an hour. "Ms. Linwood." He handed me a bottle of water. "Pace yourself." The Chardonnay here has a mean right hook. I noticed, before I noticed anything else, that he'd already unscrewed the cap halfway. A small thing. A nothing thing. But I just ended a 5-year relationship with a man who treated consideration like a finite resource to be hoarded, and the half-twist of that bottle cap landed on me like a gift. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw green eyes, a good jaw, a smile that creased his cheeks into shallow dimples. He wasn't beautiful in the way that made you look twice. He was handsome in the way that made you feel safe. Thank you, I said. Do I look like I need pacing? You look like you've been talking to investment bankers for 2 hours. That's a medical condition. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. And I thought, with the dangerous optimism of someone who wants to believe, here is a kind man. An uncomplicated man. Someone who will be steady. I didn't know, then, that steadiness and passivity can look identical from the outside. I didn't know that a man who unscrews bottle caps for you can also unscrew your life, one small, quiet turn at a time. Before the wedding, I brought Daniel to my father's house. It was a tradition, my father had said, and not a negotiable one. I want to meet the man who's marrying my daughter. Not the resume. The man. The house was a restored colonial an hour outside the city, the kind of place that held its age with dignity, wide floorboards, deep windowsills, a library that smelled of leather and old paper. My father had bought it the year after my mother died, claiming he needed a project. What he'd needed, I understood later, was a place to grieve that didn't have her fingerprints on every surface. Dinner was roast chicken, my father's specialty. He taught himself to cook after my mother passed, said a man who couldn't feed his daughter wasn't much of a father. Daniel was charming in his quiet way, answering questions about his work, his family, his plans. He said all the right things. He even helped clear the plates without being asked. Afterward, my father called me into his study. He was sitting behind his desk, his hands folded on the blotter, his eyes steady in that way they got when he was about to say something I didn't want to hear. "You're sure?" he asked. "He's good to me, Dad." "He's good to you because he doesn't have anything else to offer yet." My father's voice wasn't unkind. It was tired, the way it got when he was trying to protect me from something he'd already seen too many times. The apartment. The car. Those are yours. He's bringing a smile and a pulse. I'm not saying that makes him a bad man. I'm saying you need to think about what happens when good to you stops being enough for him. Men who bring nothing often end up resenting the woman who brought everything. I felt my shoulders stiffen. Not everyone is like Marcus. This isn't about Marcus. My father leaned forward. This is about you, Claire. You've spent your whole life building. I don't want to watch you spend your marriage filling holes that aren't yours to fill. I remember leaving his study feeling defensive, misunderstood. I told myself he was being cynical, that he'd spent too many years in business, seen too many people at their worst. I told myself Daniel was different. I was half right. Daniel was different. Just not in the way I'd meant. Margaret moved in 3 months after the wedding. The timeline was precise. Daniel mentioned it the day we returned from our honeymoon. By the end of the first month, it was a suggestion. By the end of the second, a necessity. By the third, she was at the door with her canvas tote and her chipped thermos, crying before she'd even crossed the threshold. "Danny," she said, gripping her son's arm with both hands, "Mom's going to count on you now. You're all I have left. Your father's gone. The house is so empty. I can't be alone anymore." Daniel's eyes went wet. He was her only child, and she'd raised him alone after Arthur died. A heart attack when Daniel was 12, sudden and unceremonious, the kind of death that leaves no time for goodbyes. I understood grief. I understood loyalty. I prepared the guest suite with its own bathroom, bought new linens, put a pair of soft slippers by the front door. I told myself this was what family did. You made space. You adjusted. You were generous. What I didn't understand, until it was too late, was that Margaret wasn't looking for space. She was looking for territory. Within weeks, she'd reorganized the refrigerator according to some arcane system I was never briefed on. She moved my books to make room for her collection of porcelain figurines, shepherdesses and milkmaids with chipped bonnets and vacant stares. She announced that Daniel's socks must be hand-washed because machines ruin the elastic, and he has sensitive skin. I hired a cleaning service twice. Margaret turned them away both times, telling them she'd handle it herself, and then complaining to Daniel about the waste of money. "Mom's just trying to help," Daniel said, the first time I brought it up. "She threw away my mail," I said. "A contract. It was sitting on my desk, and she threw it away because she thought it was junk. She didn't mean to. She's old, Claire. She doesn't understand your work." I let it go. I was busy. The logistics chain was in the middle of a digital overhaul, and I was working 14-hour days. When I came home, I didn't want to fight. I wanted to shower and sleep and pretend my home was still my own. So I stopped bringing things up. I stopped pushing back. I told myself I was choosing my battles. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was surrendering them one at a time. One night, I came home after midnight. A vendor negotiation had run long, and I'd spent 3 hours in a conference room with men who acted like my time was a suggestion. My feet ached. My head ached. I'd skipped dinner. I walked into the apartment to find Margaret on the sofa, watching a home shopping channel, the volume turned up high. Daniel was curled up beside her, not next to her, his head practically in her lap, eating sliced apples from a plate she held on her knee. Apple peels littered the coffee table. The remote control sat on the armrest, out of my reach. 2 plates on the table, one used, one clean. Mine. "Danny said you probably weren't hungry," Margaret said, without looking up. "So I didn't save you anything." I stood there for a moment, standing in my own living room, in my own apartment, holding my shoes in my hand, looking at a clean plate that had been set out for me and then left empty, and I felt something shift. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breaking point. It was more like a bone setting, painful, necessary, and long overdue. I turned around, walked upstairs, got in the shower, and under the hot water, with the steam rising around me, I heard Daniel's voice float up from the living room below. "Mom, don't mind her. She gets like this when work is stressful." I closed my eyes. The water beat against my shoulders, and I started doing math. Lily Dalton first appeared in my home on a Sunday afternoon. She arrived as Margaret's goddaughter, though I later learned the connection was thinner than that, a friend of a friend from Margaret's club, a young woman who'd recently moved to the city and needed guidance. The kind of young woman, Margaret made clear, who understood family values. Who knew how to cook. Who didn't work 14-hour days. "Lily works at a bank," Margaret announced, clutching the girl's hand like she was presenting a prize at a county fair. "So stable. So sweet. Danny, come say hello. Lily, this is my son. The one I'm always telling you about." Lily wore a white dress that whispered when she moved, the fabric shifting against her legs with a sound like distant rain. Her makeup was understated, the kind of makeup that takes an hour to look like it took 5 minutes. Her hair was long and dark and fell over one shoulder in a careful curtain. When she tilted her head to look at Daniel, the movement was so practiced it might have been choreographed. "Danny," she said, and the way she said his name, drawing out the vowel, letting it settle, made something in my stomach tighten. "Your mom talks about you all the time. She says you're the most devoted son she knows." Daniel's ears went pink. "She exaggerates." "She doesn't." Lily's eyes stayed on his face a beat too long. "I can tell." I sat at the head of the dining table, cutting my steak into precise, even pieces. The knife made a soft, rhythmic sound against the porcelain. I'd learned, in years of corporate dinners, how to occupy the head of a table without saying a word. It was all in the posture, the steadiness, the unblinking willingness to take up space. "Honey," I said, "pass the pepper." Daniel snapped back to attention, his hand moving toward the grinder. But Lily was faster. Her fingers brushed his as she handed it over, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, except for the way her eyes flicked to mine as it happened. Deliberate. Like a chess player sliding a pawn forward, testing the line. "Thanks," I said. I took the grinder, held her gaze, and didn't blink. "Lily, right? Margaret has so many goddaughters. Last month it was a young woman who knew all about investing. This month it's banking. Should I expect a chef next time? A sommelier?" Lily's face went pale, just for a second, just long enough to register. Then the smile snapped back into place, bright and impenetrable. Margaret let out a theatrical laugh. "Oh, Claire, you're so funny." "Lily, don't mind her. She's got a sharp tongue, but her heart's in the right place." Her heart's in the right place. The phrase settled in my chest like a swallowed pebble. I'd heard Margaret use it before, always about me, always when she was explaining away something I'd said or done that didn't fit her script. It was a dismissal dressed as a compliment, a way of saying you're difficult, but we tolerate you. I wondered if she'd been using it since the day she moved in. After that dinner, Lily became a fixture. She came for Sunday meals, then weekday evenings, then afternoons when I was at the office and couldn't object. She brought takeout when Daniel worked late. She brought cold medicine when he caught a cold. For Margaret's birthday, she presented a hand-bound photo album filled with Daniel's childhood pictures, every page a testament to decades of mother-son devotion. Who had provided the photographs for that album required no detective work. One evening, I came home early, a cancelled meeting, a shifted schedule, and found Lily curled on my sofa. She was wearing my guest slippers. The ones I'd bought for Margaret, that Margaret had apparently passed along. She was drinking from my bone china cup. The tea steaming in it was my Ming Qian Dragon Well, a gift from a business partner in Hangzhou, $90 an ounce. The cup was part of a set I'd bought in London, years before I met Daniel, each piece wrapped in tissue and carried home in my carry-on luggage. "Claire." Lily stood up, smiling her guileless smile. "Margaret asked me to pick up some old photos. Danny's in the shower. I'm just waiting for him." "What photos?" "Just old family things." Her eyes flicked toward the guest room, where Margaret was presumably organizing memories. "You know how she is about family history." I nodded. I went upstairs. I closed the bedroom door. And I retrieved the small recording device I tucked into the top shelf of my closet 2 weeks earlier, angled precisely toward the living room below. I'd bought it after the property deed incident. Not out of paranoia, out of preparation. My father had taught me that. Never walk into a negotiation without knowing what the other side is saying when they think you're not in the room. I thought, when I set it up, that I was being excessive. Now, as I pressed play, I understood that I'd simply been prescient. Lily's voice, honeyed and breathy. Danny, your wife's always so busy. You must get so lonely in this big apartment. I've always thought, a woman should put her family first, don't you agree? Daniel's voice, hesitant but warming, the tone of a man being offered flattery he wanted very badly to accept. Lily, you shouldn't say things like that. Am I wrong? You drive a Porsche. You live in a waterfront penthouse. Everyone at your office must be so envious. But does Claire make you feel like the man of the house? Last time I was here, she told you to do the dishes in front of everyone. It broke my heart to watch. A pause. Then Daniel, she's just like that. Like that. Lily laughed, soft and sharp at the same time. Danny, you deserve to be treated better. Someone who sees you. Someone who appreciates you. Silence. A long, charged silence that seemed to stretch and thicken. Then the rustle of fabric, the sound of bodies shifting on leather. The soft creak of the sofa. And Daniel's breath, catching in his throat in a way I recognized. In a way I'd heard, once, when he was with me. I clicked the recording off. Sat in the dark of my bedroom, the phone still playing its ghost voices in my head. The river glittered outside the window, indifferent and beautiful. My heartbeat was slow. Steady. The heartbeat of someone who'd already done the math and was just waiting for the final numbers to come in. I picked up my phone and called Michael Stern. Michael had been my friend for longer than I'd been anyone's wife, anyone's boss, anyone's acquisition target. We'd met in high school. He was the quiet boy in the back of the classroom, the one who always had his homework done but never raised his hand. I was the girl who couldn't stop raising hers. We'd orbited each other for years, lab partners in chemistry, debate team opponents, two overachievers who recognized a shared hunger in each other without ever quite naming it. After high school, we'd gone separate ways. He to law school, I to business school, then into my father's company. But we'd stayed in touch. He'd built his own firm from the ground up, a boutique practice specializing in corporate litigation. He'd married, had a son, divorced. I'd sent a card when his son was born. He'd sent flowers when my mother's death anniversary rolled around each year, never with a note that asked for anything, just a small arrangement of white peonies, her favorite. When I called him that night, he answered on the second ring. Claire. His voice was rough with sleep, but alert. What's wrong? I need you to look into something for me. Premarital assets. Appreciation during marriage. Fastest path to dissolution if it comes to that. A pause. I heard him sit up, heard a lamp click on. Everything okay? I'm building a contingency plan. Another pause, longer this time. Michael knew me well enough to recognize when I was in strategy mode, when the emotions had been locked in a separate room so the thinking could proceed unimpeded. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't ask if I wanted to talk about it. He asked what I needed. Let's meet, he said. Tomorrow. I'll clear my morning. Afternoon, I said. I have some evidence to collect first. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering documentation. I didn't do it in a frenzy, I did it methodically, the way I'd approach due diligence for an acquisition. Bank statements. Credit card records. Property documents. The prenuptial agreement, signed and witnessed, every page bearing Daniel's initials. I'd insisted on the prenup, Daniel had signed it without argument, which, at the time, I'd taken as a sign of his lack of materialism. I understood now that he simply hadn't read it carefully. He'd assumed, as Margaret had assumed, that marriage was a merger, not a retaining wall. I also kept the recording device running. It captured more conversations than I'd expected, Margaret coaching Daniel on how to handle me, Lily's increasingly bold flirtations, and one exchange that made me pause the playback and sit in silence for a full minute. Margaret, to Daniel, once the baby comes, everything changes. Mothers have rights. The apartment, the car, the court will make sure the child is provided for. You just need to be patient. I hadn't known, until that moment, that Lily's pregnancy was not just a possibility but a plan. The confrontation, when it came, was not an explosion. It was a surgical incision. I chose a Sunday. Margaret had invited Lily for another family dinner, and I'd encouraged it, told Margaret it would be lovely, told Daniel I was looking forward to it. I spent the morning in my study, reviewing the documents Michael had prepared. At 4 o'clock, I put on a white suit, tailored, clean lines, the kind of armor I wore into hostile negotiations, and drove to meet Michael and his junior associate at a cafe 2 blocks from the apartment. "Ready?" Michael asked. I nodded. "Let's close this account." We walked into the apartment at exactly 5:15. The scene that greeted us was almost beautiful in its domesticity, Margaret in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled of garlic and ambition. Lily at the dining table, a glass of wine already in her hand, my wine, from the cellar I'd stocked before the marriage. And Daniel, leaning over Lily's shoulder, peeling shrimp with his fingers, placing each pink curl on her plate with the tender attention of a man performing devotion. "Claire." Daniel's hand jerked. A shrimp dropped onto the tablecloth, leaving a small grease stain. "I didn't think you'd be back until..." "Until when?" "Later." I set the leather document folder in the center of the table. "Sit down, Daniel. All of you. We're going to clarify some things." Margaret came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Michael and the associate, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy suit who radiated quiet competence, the color drained from her face in stages, like water running out of a cracked bowl. "What is this?" Margaret's voice rose. "Claire, this is our home. You can't just bring strangers into our home." "Margaret." I used her name like a gavel. "We stopped being a family the moment you tried to sell my property without my consent. Please sit." She didn't sit. She stood frozen, one hand still clutching the apron, her face a battlefield of confusion and dawning dread. I pushed the documents across the polished wood. They fanned out in a precise array: property deed, car registration, bank statements, credit card records. The transcript of the recording, with key passages highlighted in yellow. Hotel receipts, itemized and dated. And a summary sheet that laid out, in Michael's clean, legal prose, the financial architecture of my marriage, every asset, every transfer, every lie. Daniel stared at the papers. His face cycled through colors like a traffic light, pink, white, gray. "Claire, you have to let me explain. Whatever you think you heard, whatever you think happened." "I don't think anything, Daniel." "I know." I pulled out the transcript and tapped a passage near the bottom. December 14th. You and Lily. The Grand Regency Hotel. Room 1224. You charged the room to my supplementary card. The one I gave you for emergencies. Daniel's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Lily shot to her feet. "This is insane. You can't just spy on people and then. I didn't turn around. Sit down, Lily. You don't get to speak in my house. You lost that privilege the moment you started sleeping with my husband on my credit card. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Margaret didn't make a sound. She was staring at the transcript, her lips moving silently, reading words she'd spoken herself, now preserved in ink. I turned back to Daniel. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign the divorce agreement that Michael has prepared. You're going to walk away with nothing, because you brought nothing, you contributed nothing, and the prenuptial agreement you signed makes that legally incontestable. The $160,000 you transferred to your mother during our marriage. I'll be pursuing recovery. The $12,000 Lily charged to my card. Included in the settlement demand. And if you fight this, if you drag this out, I will release the recordings and the hotel receipts to your employer, your colleagues, and every professional contact you have. Daniel's voice cracked, high and thin. You can't do this. I'm your husband. The law. Michael stepped forward. He'd been standing by the door, silent and still, and his movement now had the deliberate weight of a closing argument. Mr. Wren, the prenuptial agreement you signed, Section 7, which you initialed on every page, states that all assets held in each party's name remain separate property, with no community interest accrued during marriage. Additionally, adultery-based divorce in this state allows the innocent spouse to seek compensatory damages. We've calculated a reasonable figure. $105,000, plus recovery of the transferred funds. Considerate evaluation of your marriage. Daniel sagged. It was a physical thing. His shoulders dropped, his spine curved, his whole body seemed to deflate like a balloon with a slow leak. The man who'd been peeling shrimp for his mistress 60 seconds ago was gone. In his place was something smaller. Emptier. Margaret, who had been silent throughout, suddenly lunged for the papers on the table. Michael intercepted her with an arm that might as well have been a steel beam. She collapsed onto the floor instead, a theatrical crumple, the kind of fall designed for maximum audience impact, and began wailing. My life. My poor life. A daughter-in-law who destroys her own family. After everything I gave, after everything I sacrificed. I watched her. Watched the performance. And felt nothing but a clean, surgical exhaustion. Mom. Daniel bent to help her, then looked up at me. Something shifted in his face. The bewildered softness I'd mistaken for gentleness hardened into something else, resentment, cold and sudden as a winter draft. You planned this. You've been planning this for months. I've been preparing for this. There's a difference. You're a cold woman, Claire. You know that. You're ice. I looked at him. At the man I'd married because he seemed kind. Because he unscrewed bottle caps and had dimples and never raised his voice. And I felt, in that moment, a strange, almost dizzying sense of clarity. He was right. I was cold. I'd learned to be cold because warmth, in the wrong hands, was just an invitation to be burned. Maybe, I said. But I'm also the woman who owns this apartment. And I need you to be out of it by Friday. The divorce finalized 3 months later. Daniel tried to fight, briefly, hired a lawyer who took his money and achieved nothing, but the prenup was ironclad, and the evidence was overwhelming. On the day of the final hearing, he showed up unshaven, his suit rumpled, his eyes sunk into dark hollows that made him look a decade older than he was. He signed the papers with a trembling hand and didn't look at me once. Lily's pregnancy had become visible by then. She moved into the one-bedroom rental Daniel found, a cramped unit in a crumbling complex 40 minutes from the city, where the walls were thin and the plumbing moaned when it rained. She still believed, in those early weeks, that there was money hidden somewhere. She asked Daniel about the Porsche, about the penthouse, about when they'd get back on their feet. Daniel didn't have answers. He'd been forced to resign from his firm. My lawyers had made it clear that the alternative was public disclosure, and his job applications were met with silence. His reputation had spread through the industry with the quiet, efficient persistence of dry rot. The discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel was in the shower, and Lily, looking for a pregnancy tracking app, opened his phone. The banking app was right there on the home screen. She tapped it. Available balance, $45.83. She checked the other accounts. All of them. Together they totaled less than $300. She opened his saved links and found a public records entry, an enforcement action, a judgment lien. Daniel's name. Amount due, $326,000. She sat on the closed toilet lid, the phone heavy in her hand, and felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She thought about the Sunday dinners. The bone china cup. The Porsche in the parking garage. Margaret's voice, conspiratorial and certain, once the baby comes, everything changes. She thought about her resignation letter, the way her supervisor had looked at her with genuine concern and said, "Lily, are you absolutely sure you want to give up a full-time position to be a stay-at-home girlfriend?" She had been so sure. She had looked at Daniel Wren and seen a man of means, a man of substance, a man who lived in a penthouse and drove a Porsche and had a wife who handled all the tedious financial details so he didn't have to. She had seen what Margaret wanted her to see, the illusion. Not the scaffolding behind it. Now she was holding a receipt for $45.83. The fight that erupted when Daniel emerged from the shower was loud enough to bring the neighbors to the walls. Lily threw the phone at his chest. She called him a liar, a fraud, a hollow man in a borrowed suit. Margaret came rushing in, arms flapping, trying to defend her son, and Lily turned on her with a fury that made the older woman stumble backward. "You told me he was wealthy. You told me he was stable. You told me everything would be taken care of. I gave up my job. I gave up my apartment. I'm carrying his child, and he has $45. Don't you speak to me like that." Margaret shrieked. "After everything I did for you, inviting you into our home, treating you like a daughter. You treated me like bait." Lily's voice dropped, cold and quiet. "You used me to get at Claire. And now we all have nothing." She left that night. She terminated the pregnancy 2 weeks later, a decision she documented carefully, along with every text message Daniel had ever sent her promising a future that didn't exist. A month after that, she filed a lawsuit claiming fraudulent misrepresentation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking $266,000 in damages. The lawsuit was her final, desperate attempt to extract value from a situation that had none. She won a fraction of what she'd asked, $56,000, payable in installments, and then disappeared to a different state. Someone told me she married a small business owner a few years later. I didn't verify the rumor. I didn't care enough to try. Margaret's stroke happened 6 months after the divorce. Daniel had been struggling. The freelance work he'd scraped together was erratic. The lien payments were relentless. The one-bedroom rental was shrinking around them both. The pressure had been building, and it found its release on a Tuesday morning when Lily's lawsuit papers arrived in the mail. Daniel read them standing in the kitchen. Margaret was at the stove, making his eggs the way he liked them, sunny side up, edges crispy, the way she'd made them every morning since he was a boy. She turned when she heard him make a sound, a low, animal noise, something between a groan and a growl. "Danny? What is it?" "She's suing me." His voice was flat, disbelieving. Lily. She's suing me for $266,000. She terminated the pregnancy. She said she didn't want to raise a liar's baby. Margaret's face went slack. She can't do that. She's carrying your child. She's family. She's not carrying anything anymore. Daniel looked up at his mother. Really looked at her. And something that had been building for months, years, maybe, finally broke through the surface. This is your fault. What? You brought her here. You kept pushing her at me. You told me to sell Claire's apartment. You told me I deserved better. Every single thing that's gone wrong, was your idea. And now I have nothing. Nothing. He shoved her. Not a calculated act of violence, a blind, desperate, reactive shove, the kind of movement a drowning person makes when they're trying to push something away. But Margaret was 71 years old, and her balance wasn't what it had been. She stumbled backward, her hip catching the corner of the kitchen table with a dull, sickening thud. She made a small sound, more surprise than pain, and then her left side went numb. Her face slackened. One eyelid drooped. The corner of her mouth slid downward like melting wax. She tried to speak, but the words came out slurry and shapeless, a language only she could understand. The ambulance took 23 minutes. Daniel stood in the hallway, smoking, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold the lighter steady. A neighbor later told me he kept repeating the same phrase, over and over, "It's all gone. It's all gone." The diagnosis was a hemorrhagic stroke. Margaret survived, but her right side was dead weight, her speech reduced to guttural sounds and the occasional recognizable word, Danny, mostly, and once, startlingly clear, home. Daniel couldn't afford rehabilitation. He brought her back to the one-bedroom rental, set up a hospital bed in the corner of the living room, and started taking whatever freelance work he could find online, data entry, virtual assistants, one disastrous attempt at ghostwriting that ended in a non-payment dispute. The lien payments ate half his income. The rest went to rent, to utilities, to the cheapest adult diapers he could find at the discount pharmacy. At first, he tried. He changed the sheets when they got soiled. He spoon-fed her soup and wiped her chin afterward. He spoke to her in a low, patient voice, explaining who he was, where they were, what day it was. But the work was relentless, every few hours, day and night, and Daniel had never been trained in relentless. He'd been trained in being taken care of. In having women's hands handle the unglamorous labor of living. His mother had spent his entire life ensuring he never had to carry anything heavy, and now the heaviest thing in the world was lying in a hospital bed in his living room, and he had no idea how to lift it. The yelling started in the 3rd month. "Can't you just hold it? For once. I'm trying to work, and you're lying there. You're just lying there, useless, day after day." Margaret would weep, her lopsided face contorting, her working hand clutching at the bedsheet with a grip that was stronger than it looked. She couldn't answer. Couldn't defend herself. Couldn't remind him of the decades she'd spent wiping his face, cutting his apples, hand-washing his socks because the machine was too rough. She had poured her entire self into building a son who knew only how to receive, and now she was drowning in the empty space where his gratitude should have been. She died on a winter night, 2 years after the stroke. The neighbors heard shouting first, Daniel's voice, raw and ragged, pushed past its limit. Then a heavy thud. Then a long, spreading silence. He found her on the floor beside the hospital bed. Her eyes were open. Her mouth was frozen in the shape of a word she'd never managed to say. He didn't arrange a funeral. Couldn't afford one. The county cremated her, and the urn sat on a shelf in the rental, gathering a fine layer of dust that Daniel never wiped away. Sometimes he'd look at it. Sometimes he'd talk to it, angry, broken monologues that no one else heard. Most of the time, he just sat in the dark, the television flickering, the apartment silent except for the drip of the leaky faucet he'd never learned how to fix. I heard all of this in fragments, over the years that followed, a detail from a former colleague, a news item forwarded by someone who'd known us both, a chance mention at an industry event. I didn't seek out the information. I didn't need to. The story was no longer mine. It was just the echo of a life I'd already left behind. What mattered now was the life I was building. Michael and I dated for a year after the divorce. I was cautious, more cautious than I'd ever been, because I'd learned the hard way that desire could look like kindness, that attention could look like love, and that I was capable of being fooled. Michael didn't push. He showed up. He made dinner. He did the dishes without being asked. When I had nightmares, and I did, for a while, dreams about locked safes and canvas tote bags and a clean plate set out for me and left empty, he'd wake up beside me, press a glass of water into my hand, and say, "I'm here." Nothing more. Nothing less. Just presence, steady and undemanding. His son, Noah, was 5 when I first met him, a quiet boy with his father's thoughtful eyes and a habit of drawing elaborate animal kingdoms on any scrap of paper he could find. He was shy around me at first, hiding behind Michael's legs, peering out with one cautious eye. I started baking animal-shaped cookies on weekends, elephants, giraffes, a slightly deformed penguin that Noah declared his favorite because he looks like he's trying his best. Around month 8, he started calling me Claire Mom. I didn't correct him. I proposed to Michael on my 35th birthday. I'd booked a private room at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, the same harbor I could see from my apartment windows, though I'd since sold the penthouse and bought a house with a garden, a place where children could run and Margaret's ghost didn't linger in the corners. The ring was in a small velvet box, tucked inside a chocolate lava cake. Michael cut into it, his fork hit something solid, and his face went through a sequence I wish I'd photographed: confusion, then dawning comprehension, and then a raw, unguarded emotion that made his eyes wet. "Claire Linwood," he said, his voice rough. "You couldn't even let me propose." "Cut your losses," I said, grinning. "You taught me that." He laughed. It was a good laugh, full and warm, the kind that filled a room. He said yes. Our wedding was small. 30 people in my father's garden, the same garden where I'd played as a child, where my mother had planted roses that still bloomed every June. My father walked me down the aisle, a short, grassy aisle between rows of white chairs, and when he placed my hand in Michael's, he said, quietly, "This one. This one is right." Oliver and Hannah were born 2 years later, within 3 minutes of each other, 2 small, furious bundles of life that turned our quiet house into a chaos of diapers and lullabies and exhausted, euphoric laughter. I remember holding them both in the hospital bed, one in each arm, and thinking, this is what I was waiting for. Not the children, exactly, though they were wonderful, but the feeling of building something that wasn't a project. Something that wasn't a solo effort. Something that gave back as much as it took. Years later, on an ordinary Sunday, Michael and I dropped the children at his parents' house and went to see a matinee. A silly action movie, the kind where things explode for no reason and the hero walks away from the fire without looking back. We held hands in the dark and shared a bag of popcorn that Michael had insisted on buying even though I'd said I wasn't hungry. Afterward, we walked along the river. It was autumn again, The same pale, rinsed gold light I remembered from that morning, years ago, when the espresso machine was hissing and Margaret's voice was cutting through the quiet. The water glittered. The wind smelled like pine. Do you ever regret it? Michael asked. How it all went down. I watched the light on the water for a long moment. I thought about the girl in the black dress, the man with the bottle cap, the canvas tote filled with thermoses and bad intentions. I thought about safes and recordings and the cold, clarifying shock of recognition. I thought about the clean plate on the coffee table, the bone china cup in Lily's hand, the red leather of a property deed clutched in fingers that had no right to touch it. No, I said. A clean cut is the deepest kindness you can give yourself. Michael squeezed my hand. We walked until the sun dipped below the buildings, and then we walked a little more, because there was no reason to hurry. The children were safe. The house was waiting. The life we'd built together was solid and unhaunted. The books were clean. The day had begun.